Welcome back. We are discussing the back series of the GDP data released late last week, which showed that GDP growth was pretty fast under the two UPA regimes, first at 8% and then at 7.7%, compared to the about 7.2, 7.3% in the last 4 years. That is the NDA government. Joining us to discuss this data further are Soumya Ghosh, the Group Chief Economic Advisor of SBI, TC Anant, former Chief Statistician of India, and Prasanna, Chief Economist, ICICI Securities Primary Dealership. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. Professor Anant, from this wealth of data that has been thrown up by the committee which has given us the back series, what can be the key lesson? I'm asking you because, you know, in some years of high growth, like FY06, FY07, when growth is as high as 8.5%, 9.5%, we also have, you know, very mediocre indirect tax collection. Does it look like even during the first 5 years of 2003 to 2008, growth seems to have come more because of global reasons rather than factors essentially Indian?
Look, it's very hard to figure that out as to what component of the growth is global and what constitute Indian. And, you know, you're connecting a third element to it, which is the indirect tax collections, which are influenced by a variety of other considerations. So I think the issue of how much of the growth is through domestic demand or domestic sources and how much of it is due to a global pull factor is probably much more complex and can't be analyzed by just looking at it from a 1 year or 2 years number.
All right. Okay.
But no, let me complete this.
Sure.
I think a general observation is probably true that for economies across the world from a period from about 98, 99 till 2006, 2007, there was a very large global upcycle in growth. And this is probably part of a much longer run cycle, which probably goes back about 20 odd years.
Okay.
But, you know, beyond that, doing business cycle type exercises is very complicated and shouldn't be done with just 1 or 2 years numbers.
Okay. Well, I want your take on another factor that stands out in the new data presented by this committee. You know, in several years, 2003, 2004, and again in 2005-06, and again in 2009-10, we find that the GVA is higher than the GDP. Does that signify that much of the growth came probably through, you know, higher subsidies and lower taxes, and therefore not necessarily a very healthy trend?
See, as far as as a general principle, that is true that if GVA growth is higher than that of GDP, it in effect implies that your net indirect taxes are not not growing well enough. So that's a problem. So that's a general principle. But you know, one of the problems with this series which is done, this is not a back series in the sense that this is not a reconstruction of the past using essentially trying to sort of say how does the past compare with the newer approaches which have been identified in the base revision.
Okay.
This is purely a statistical splicing. You know, what they say, it retains all the characters of the estimates which were generated in the old series with all their limitations. Okay. It's really saying, if you read what they have said carefully, what it is saying is, here is a method for splicing the two series, and the method they are saying is that there is a difference in levels which takes place at the time of the base year change. We are going to take that as the only factor which matters between the new and the old base year, which is a simplification in the first place, and distribute this for over a period of 15 years, 15 being arbitrary, and the rest we will keep as what the old series had done. Now, please understand, it's a very interesting technical exercise. And in a sense, what Professor Bhanumurthy has done is he had proposed this as a way of splicing at some point back. he was a member of this group, so he decided that let this also go as a committee's recommendation.
Okay.
But it is not the traditional way in which people would think about regenerating back series is concerned. And in fact, the group starts with that.
Okay.
If you read the group's report, they note how it should be done. They note the difficulties in doing it. And they say, as an alternative, consider this. And, you know, as I said, it's the usefulness of this is when you try to match the indicators which are generated with all other measures which you get, to try to figure out does it make sense or not.
All right, now that's a methodological challenge for which I would have wanted Professor Mundal to stay on, but that discussion for another day. Let me get to Soumya. Soumya, you know, giving it a political slant would mean that things were very good in the 10 years from 2003 to 2013, and then they started slowing a bit. Is one lesson from this data that you know, we should not aspire to double-digit growth, and that when that kind of growth comes with high fiscal deficits and loose monetary policy, the next 4 years actually pay for that the sins of high growth?
No, to some extent, I would agree with your point, but just I want to make one observation regarding the data. I appreciating Professor Anand's point, but the new series which has been put out, I mean, whatever recommendations, and the old GDP series which is already there in public domain, and if you compare the gap between them for a period of 18 years, the gap is only 7 basis points. So from that point of view, the new GDP data which has been put out largely conforms with the trend of the old GDP data. Now coming to a specific point of whether and 10% growth is sustainable or not, yes, clearly if I look into the data, in 2005, 6 and 6, 7 and it's 9, 10, the global growth average was 5.5%. Now against this backdrop, Indian economy lost up a 10% growth rate in I think 2007, 8 and then again in 10, 11, but that was entirely on the back of a fiscal stimulus because the growth had collapsed to 4.2% and they recovered. So, and the important thing is from the data if you glean is that the data is significantly volatile on either direction. On some basis point is declining by 600 basis points, then is jumping by 700 basis points. So, it means that there are some external factors which is at play and we are trying to balance that external factors through some sort of a stimulus. And that if it is pushes up the growth to beyond 9 and 10% with a nominal GDP growth of 21%, I think that is clearly sustainable for a country like India.
Oh, clearly sustainable.
Clearly unsustainable for a country like India.
Okay, I think that is a key lesson which Professor Mundal also was telling us. He is putting potential output and maybe potential growth as well around 7.1%. Prasanna, what are your key learnings from this wealth of 20 years of data that has been put out? Are there any lessons that we should draw from the series of numbers, the deflators, the fiscal deficit tables that have been put out? Or is this very limited? Should we also have other things like, you know, current account deficits, global GDP to draw any seminal lessons?
I think first of all, I think we should recognize that having this kind of back series is definitely important. I mean, even after accepting the limitations of whatever methodology one might choose, because having a comparable back series, it's very difficult to have a yardstick for measuring or kind of assessing the numbers which you have in the present day. So from that point of view, definitely this is quite important. Of course, with the caveat that this is all provisional and this has been debated, I guess, further by CSO and other committees, and they have to accept it. The second issue is, of course, I think in terms of if you look at the particular years being talked about, whether it's 2004 to 9 or 9 to 14 or whatever, I mean, anyway, they were high growth years. So, I mean, this has kind of pushed up the average a bit more. It's not that it's dramatically rewritten the narrative. So from that point of view, there is not too much of new information for us. But the broader point, I think, which you kind of raised in previous questions also, I think, yes, I mean, the context definitely matters. And I think it's been pointed out probably in the global financial crisis, pre-2008 period, global growth was very strong, and that was a very important tailwind for India. So it is like a rising tide lifts all boats, so we definitely benefited. Probably, I think the issue was after the crisis when a lot of economies globally were struggling. I think there was, if I may say so, I think we overstimulated our economy and it was not needed.
Yeah.
And of course, I think the issue is when growth dramatically slows down, I think the passions of the moment take over. And I'm sure 2 years down the line, if you go back to 5% growth, and if you call 10 people, 9 out of 10 people will be saying that we should do more stimulus.
Okay.
I guess that's a short-term thinking which kind of affects everyone, whether it's policymakers or analysts.
So what would be the long-term lessons you will draw from these numbers? Would you say that 3.5% fiscal deficit, a 2% current account deficit, these are the broad limits we should stick to? And another variable, which of course is not part of this at all, credit growth, in some years was even 30%, 25%, 24%. Should we have limits that when it goes to above 15%, there is a red flag and we must pull back on policy? Prasanna.
No, so starting conditions matter. So then again, if you go back to early 2000s, I think India was definitely underbanked country or underpenetrated country in terms of financial services. So if you look at credit to GDP ratio, for example, I think there was a lot of scope for it to grow. And you should remember structurally interest rates came down. And again, that credit has to be given to the NDA government between 1998 and 2004 when they brought down interest rates across a whole spectrum of administered interest rates, right?
Yes.
So these are some of the starting conditions which you have to remember. And I guess that's why I think instead of looking at credit growth, probably I would look at a credit to GDP kind of a ratio. And again, how fast it is going. So whether it's outpacing GDP quite rapidly.
Okay.
And I think there are metrics like this which even the IMF uses to assess whether a country is overheating. On fiscal deficit, I think it's an important thing to note. I think, again, you look at household savings, you look at household financial savings, and accordingly you draw fiscal deficit targets. I think the 3% plus 3%, total 6% target was drawn when household financial savings was around 10-12% of GDP.
Yep.
Now we have come down to around 8% of GDP. So clearly I think the targets are very high. I think the targets has to be cut down. Probably you should look at 2.5% for center and 1.5% for states.
Okay.
On a consolidated basis, we should target 4% of GDP as a fiscal deficit.
Okay.
I think that is something which has to be looked at in the context of all these numbers.
Okay. Well, the MPC is going to love you, Prasanna. Soumya, one last word from you. What would be the key lessons? The lesson that Prasanna is telling us is that this is a limited set of parameters that we should look at. We should also look at household savings, credit as a percentage of GDP. Basically, what should policymakers learn from the data that's put forward by this committee?
See, just one point, Latha, very quickly I want to make. The one important redeeming feature of the data is that from the 1993-94 onwards, if you look into the data, given the volatility in the GDP data, it means that you are actually over-dependent on global economic conditions for our growth to be buoyant. So which should never be the case, because we should do our internal maths right, continue on the path of prudence. But possibly, I think I should give a little bit of leeway to the policymakers, given the situation is currently running a little bit difficult. But in my sense, don't take the external conditions as an endogenous parameter in your growth model. Take it as exogenous and work on the structural prudence and macroeconomic prudence, because that will be the only sustainable way forward in the long term.
Okay. Similar question to you, Professor Anant. What should be the lesson that policymakers should draw?
You know, Latha, I tend to find both of these somewhat uncomfortable because I am reluctant to draw too many lessons in these matters. I think what happens is macroeconomists love time series data because then they can draw grand stories, and our general experience with this has been that these grand stories don't work.
Okay.
And the global financial crisis should be a signal lesson to all of them as to how easy it is to misread stories and stuff.
Okay.
The data does have some very interesting observations to make. And I think one of the interesting observations, I mean, it's difficult to read the data by itself, and I think it's important to keep the data alongside information on prices and stuff alongside, is there was a crisis in 2008 that, of course, everybody knows. The stimulus helped revive it. But, and I think this is the big but, which has not been adequately understood. There are two ways of looking at it. One way that we overstimulated the economy, that is possible. There's another way of looking at it, is that we first overstimulated, then panicked and reduced it very rapidly, immediately.
Okay.
And the consequence to the economy was quite bad.
Okay.
I think the problem with trying to draw major lessons is people tend to go for knee-jerk solutions,
Yes.
one way or the other.
Okay.
And those are not desirable.
All right.
More importantly, and I'll be close, I think it's very, very dangerous to draw too many messages from what are essentially aggregative numbers constructed under a lot of assumptions. So don't go overboard on them.
All right. That's useful advice for policymakers, Professor Anant, and also for those who are mudslinging on the basis of these numbers. Gentlemen, thank you very much for bringing a lot of sanity and richness to the discussion. Prasanna, Soumya and Professor Anant, thank you very much for joining us. One message from these gentlemen is that don't look at only GDP data. We have to look at a whole host of other aligned or allied data, like, for instance, credit to GDP, credit growth itself, as well as the global environment in which all this is playing out. And don't overdraw lessons as well. That might lead to policy errors too. But I think the seminal message also coming is India is not quite prepared for double-digit growth. If you aspire too early, you end up making policy mistakes and pay for it in the remaining 4 years. Thank you very much for joining us in this very rich discussion on the back series data on GDP.